When you're looking at a metrics dashboard, you can usually tell pretty quickly that something is happening. Checkout errors are showing up, a page feels slower, a funnel looks a little weird. But the annoying part is what comes next, because the chart usually doesn't tell you why it's happening. It just gives you a number, and then you have to hunt through traces, logs, errors, whatever else you have. That's the part that Sentry's application metrics are solving. The metric itself is useful, but the more interesting part is that the metric can be connected back to the request that produced it. So we'll start with the basics. What application metrics are, how you send them, and what they look like on a dashboard. Then we'll get to the workflow that actually matters, starting from a metric, opening the samples behind it, and jumping into a trace. Application metrics are custom signals that you send from your own application code. That's the main idea. Instead of only watching infrastructure level stuff like CPU or memory, you're tracking things that are specific to how your app works and how people are using it. There are three types of metrics you can send: counters, gauges, and distributions. A counter is something that happened. An email was sent, a checkout failed, an API request came in. You're counting occurrences. A gauge is a value at a specific point in time. Queue depth, active connections, memory used, anything where the current value is what you care about. A distribution is for values where one number doesn't really tell the whole story. Durations, sizes, order totals. You probably care about averages, percentiles, min and max, that kind of thing. So if you remember nothing else from this section, counters count things, gauges track current state, and distributions help you understand a set of values over time. Sending these is pretty straightforward. You use the Sentry SDK, usually in the same places where you're already handling the events you care about. For a counter, you call sentry.metrics.count. Give the metric a name and pass the value you want to count. For a gauge, you call sentry.metrics.gauge and send the current value. For a distribution, you call sentry.metrics.distribution, send the value, and optionally include a unit like milliseconds. The part that makes these more useful later is attributes. Attributes are just key value pairs that let you filter or group the metric after it lands in Sentry. That might be an endpoint, a region, the source of an action, the current step in a flow, or user tier, whatever context makes the metric easier to understand later. Sentry also attaches some context automatically, like the environment, the release, the user information, browser information, and trace context whenever it's available. The only practical thing that I would call out is the size. Metric events have a 2 kilobyte limit, so your attributes should be useful, but you don't want to shove a whole payload in there. Once those metrics are coming in, you can put them on a dashboard. The one I'm using here is a demo e-commerce app. So treat it as an example, not as the complete list of what application metrics can do. At the top, I have cart engagement. Cart ads are a counter. The items in cart is a distribution. And the source breakdown is a simple example of why attributes are useful, because I can see where those cart ads came from. For example, if I zoom in here, I can see that parts of my cart ads are coming in from the product detail page, which I am sending as an attribute, while all the rest are just from the products list. And then there's the checkout funnel. This is the kind of area where metrics are especially useful because submits, successes, and errors are all signals you probably want to watch over time. For order total and the items per checkout, a distribution makes sense because I'm not just asking whether something happened. I care about the shape of those values. And then there's also the AI chat widget section, where the metrics are more about product behavior. Opens, conversations started, messages sent, and where people are in the flow. And then lastly, there's the front-end performance, where the metrics are things like product load duration, image render time, image load time, and P75 trends. The important thing is not this specific dashboard. The point is that once you send the metric with useful attributes, you can make the signal visible and slice it in ways that match your app. You can build these manually in Metrics Explorer, ask Seer to generate a dashboard from a prompt, or have a coding agent scan your repo and create one with Sentry CLI. I'm not going to turn this into a dashboard building tutorial though. For this video, the dashboard is just a place where we notice the signal. The next question is, what happens when we want to investigate it? The reason Sentry can do more with these metrics is that it stores metric events, not just pre-aggregated totals. That means the metric can keep useful context with it. In this demo, I'm keeping the attributes pretty simple. Source, step, release, environment, and things like that. So when I group checkouts over time by status or messages by step, that's not magic. That's just a metric carrying enough context to make the chart useful later. But the context I care about most is trace context. If a metric event is connected to a trace, then the metric is no longer just a number on a dashboard. It can become a starting point for debugging. That's a pretty important distinction. A normal chart can tell you something is happening over there. A trace-connected metric can help you get from that chart into the request that produced one of the samples behind it. This is how I think about where metrics fit in with the rest of Sentry. Metrics are a great way for watching signals over time. Errors tell you when something actually broke. Traces show the path a request took. Logs fill in details. Monitors turn signals into something you can get notified about. So, application metrics don't replace errors, traces, or logs. They give you another way to notice that something is worth looking at, and then the rest of Sentry helps you figure out what happened. A decent rule of thumb is, if your team would check a number first when something feels wrong, that number is probably a good candidate for an application metric. Let's walk through the investigation flow, because this is the part that makes the feature click for me. Say I'm looking at the checkout chart and I want to understand the error signal. I don't need the chart to be dramatic, I just need a time window I want to inspect. The first step is to narrow the chart in that window. In the UI, you can click and drag over the parts of the widget you care about, and Sentry zooms the dashboard into that range. From there, you can open the widget menu and click Open in Explore. That takes the same query and the same time range into a more focused investigation view. We can see the same series from that chart, so this is the checkout success, then we have the checkout submit.click, and also the checkout submit.error. In this case, errors are what I'm interested in. In Explore, the samples tab is the important part. Instead of only looking at the line on the chart, you can see metric events from the time range. And when a sample has a trace context, as we can see here, all of these have trace IDs, you get a link from that metric event into the trace attached to it. So now you're not staring at an aggregate anymore. You're looking at the actual requests with the waterfall, with all of the spans to that waterfall, logs if they're connected, and as we saw earlier, any connected errors on that same trace. That's where the investigation becomes much more practical. You can look at what the request was doing, where time was spent, what errors happened around it, and whether Seer or Autofix can help explain this issue. So the flow is, start with the metric signal, narrow the time range if you need to, open the sample, and use a trace link to get into that request context. That might feel small, but it changes the starting point. You're not opening a dashboard, seeing a number, and then beginning a totally separate investigation. The metric gives you a path into the rest of the debugging data. There is one caveat here, and it's worth saying clearly. Metrics and traces are not sampled the same way. Application metrics are captured at 100%, so the chart is still accurate. Traces, depending on your setup, are often sampled at a lower rate. So every metric event counts towards the chart, but not every sample will necessarily have a trace link. If a trace is there, great. If it's not, the metric is still counted correctly. You can also go in the other direction and search for traces that have a specific application metric attached. That's useful when you want to start from the metric name and find traces related to it. Once you know a metric matters, the next question is, do you really want to keep watching a dashboard for it? Usually no. That's where metric monitors come in. So let's pick this metric, cart adds over time. We're going to open it in Explorer, and then we're going to save it as a monitor. So save as monitor for the sum of the cart.add metric. I'll make sure my project matches. I'll then define the monitor threshold and set myself as the default assignee. Lastly, I'll decide if I want to get notified whenever my metric crosses that threshold. I can get an email, a Slack or Discord message, whatever. When the metric crosses that condition, Sentry will open an issue automatically. And because the metric is connected to the trace content, if we click in Open in Application Metrics and click on the Samples tab, we get much closer to the request that triggered the alert, instead of just telling you something happened. Good luck. So the workflow is pretty simple. Make the signal visible, use samples and traces to investigate it, and then monitor it so the next one comes to you. So that's the version of application metrics I think is worth paying attention to. You have counters to things that happen, gauges for current values, and distributions for values where you care about the shape over time. You send them from code, add attributes so they're easier to slice later, put the important ones on a dashboard, and then use Explore to get from a metric sample into a trace. If you're trying this for the first time, I wouldn't start by instrumenting everything. Pick one metric that your team already cares about, the thing you check first when something feels off. Application metrics are available in Sentry SDK 10.25 and later, and every plan includes 5 GB of application metrics. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.